Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Vickers, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled To Care for Those Who Have Borne the Battle, a primer for behavioral health providers who serve older veterans. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located in the lower right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions as you think of them, and the presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and use the I will call in telephone option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen to receive certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on FADA's website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoint, go to www.fada.org, then to our Resource Center, and then to our training library. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credit earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credits for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on FADA's website. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as a part of registering remains confidential. Will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Please note that the evaluation will close midnight Tuesday, May 10th. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers when you register for our webinars and workshops. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide a certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Stanley McCracken. Dr. McCracken is a retired the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. He has 40 years of experience as a clinician, educator, and consultant. He has written about psychiatric rehabilitation, addiction, behavioral pharmacological, behavioral medicine, aging, motivational interviewing, and staff training. His practice interests include mental health, drug and medical problems, aging, cross-cultural and spiritual issues in clinical practice, and caring for veterans. He served as a linguist in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and has worked with many veterans programs, including the VA Rush Road Home Program, Urban Warriors, and the Lake County Veterans and Family Services Foundation. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter for today, Dr. Stanley. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Listening to the conversation about, what you have to do to get the slides and do all of those things there. One of the things that you should probably know about me, it's not in my bio, I came that close to being the president. And it's because I said that if I'm elected president, my first executive order will be that everyone will be who turns 50 years old on your 50th birthday, you will be assigned a 6-year-old child to help you with digital doodads like computers, your phone, reprogramming your television, all of that stuff. And the first time that you ask that child for help and the child rolls their eyes, then you get to trade him for a new 6-year-old. I will tell you, I pretty much had the over 50 vote locked. So just to let you know that that's, how things go, and that might have been the president. So today we'll be talking about the care for those who are born in a battle. And let's see here if I can get this to go. Okay. Executives, participants will know about military ethos, some of the ways civilians are transformed into warriors, difficulties transition back, characteristics of moral injury, late onset stress symptomatology, and how PTSD differs from moral injury, traumatic loss, and stress, late onset stress symptomatology or loss, and be able to conduct an assessment of military service and veteran status. Most scholarship is based on cohorts who have scholarship on aging, based on cohorts who have had significant experience with war, wartime experiences, and this, by the way, includes people who have served as well as spouses and the children of people who have served. Wartime experiences may therefore be a critical but largely hidden variable underlying current scientific understanding of aging. So the question is, will this knowledge apply to current cohorts who have not had experience of war? And so one of the things that you want to look at anytime you're reading a book on aging these days is, do they in fact address wartime and wartime service and the impact on people's development? And I'll leave that question with you and let it hang until the end of the presentation. Now, I think this graph here kind of tells the story. Now, first of all, one of the things that I would say is the data for women, okay, that lower light green line, I would not trust that line, because one of the characteristics is that women who have served in the military consistently underreport service for a variety of reasons. However, note the top, the dark green line. This is a percentage of men who have served in the military. Now, if you notice down to the 65 to 69 era there, people, and this was done in 2012, so if someone 75 years older or older comes in for services, he has about a 50% chance of the likelihood of serving in the military. And you notice this drop off here at age 52 down to 39 down to 21. Well, what happened during this drop off from 52 to 39%? Remember, the draft was ended, the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War ended. So now we have what we used to be during the World War II and from Vietnam and previous, up to 80% of men who were in the military, okay, down to now about 7% of people who served in the military. So the question is, as these younger people are aging, will what we know about aging, having studied this older cohort, will that still apply? And that's a good question. So again, if a man is 75 years or older, comes in for services, he's likely to have served in the military. Okay, so what is a veteran? And typically when people think about veterans, they typically think about this person up here in the middle on the top row. Those are the warriors, the people who actually saw combat, the guys who are in there kicking down doors, and now it's men and women who are in there kicking down doors. But all of these other people, lawyers, musicians, chefs, pilots, doctors, nurses, social workers, family members, musicians, all of these people also have served in the military. So veterans are a broad group of people who have served. Vietnam veterans, currently, Vietnam veterans are the largest veteran group in the U.S. So if we look at this group here, starting up close to 8 million in 2010, in 2019, we still have we have right now about 6 million left. The other groups there, the post 9/11, this is a bar in yellow, and Gulf War pre 9/11, the bar in purple. Looks like we have about somewhere between 3 and 4 million veterans there. But again, the largest veteran group that's in the U.S. right now is our Vietnam veterans. The World War II and Korean veterans, we're losing that cohort very rapidly. So, excuse me. So what about Vietnam and before versus post-Vietnam? First of all, there's been no draft since Vietnam. That means the current military is an all-volunteer professional military. Now, one of the things that I do in my church, I'm a service leader at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. And so I lead a, excuse me, Unitarian service about once a month or so. And one of the things that I first noticed when I started doing that was, first of all, the service people, the recruits, were much older than I remembered. They were more married than they were when I was in basic training, and there were also more female than they were when I was in basic training. So these are all volunteers, okay, and they chose to sign up. There are now greater roles for women and a greater number of women in the military, and there's also a greater use of Reserve and National Guard. So, for example, when people of my generation heard that George W. Bush was in the Air National Guard, what many of us heard, was that he had a powerful and well-connected family member who got him into the Guard or Reserve. It's because during Vietnam, especially after the war was up and running, it was pretty hard to get into the Guard and Reserve. And the Guard and Reserve was much more likely to be deployed to the combat zone now than they were previously. Lessons learned in Vietnam have been applied to the post-Vietnam military. So first of all, we have better recognition and treatment of PTSD, better equipment and medical care. So what does that mean? That means that people are surviving wounds that would have been lethal in the past. What does this also mean? Well, not as well, the percentage of people who die are much greater. We have people that are surviving that have horrific wounds and a loss of limbs and problems that have continued after discharge and after they were back in civilian life. We also, units are deploying and returning as a unit. In Vietnam, people were rotating in and out, so that there were, most units were pretty much continually having new people coming in and experienced people going out. And what we found out is what they're doing now is that they're doing much the same thing that they did during World War II, is that they're training and deploying and returning as a unit. Needless to say, that contributes to bonding and unit cohesion. Distinction for support for the war and support for warriors. One of the things that you will hear Vietnam veterans say is, never will our military be treated this way again. When Vietnam veterans came back or returned back to the United States, excuse me, they were greeted. In fact, one of my friends, and I'll have a quote from him later, who is a Marine who was in the Tet Offensive in 1968. When he came back from Vietnam, he was greeted at the airport by protesters who threw full baby diapers at them. Okay. And so one of the things that I noticed during the protests about the war in Iraq, was that even though people were protesting the war, they still were not protesting and treating the warriors, the military, the same way. Now, are there exceptions to that? Absolutely. But in general, people were received much better than they were during Vietnam. Military and warrior ethos. Culture is the sum of all tangible and intangible concepts, objects, and behaviors that make up a way of life. Culture is inescapable, all part of a culture. Ethos is narrower, it's a narrower concept. It refers more narrowly to the values and guiding ideas that unite a group of persons who share a common identity. Now, not everyone subscribes to an ethos, so not everyone shares significant facets of his or her identity with a group of other like-minded people. One of the things that you probably, for those of you who were trained as social workers, I would argue that there is a social work ethos, a set of values, a set of guiding ideas and principles that that are similar among people in the profession. Some of the components of the warrior ethos are selflessness, stoicism, and an oath to protect and defend our national identity. And these are a few components of the warrior ethos for women and men in the military. Now, part of that stoicism and selflessness will interfere sometimes with people coming in for treatment. So engaging people in treatment. Oh, and by the way, one thing I realized I should have mentioned, as you have questions, at least at the beginning, as you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll address the questions or comments as I go along. If at some point, for purposes of time, I need to move things along faster, I may put a pause on that and then take the rest at the end. But for the beginning, as comments or questions come up, please feel free to put those in the chat room. Now, military subcultures are more alike than they're different, okay? Service members differ in how closely they identify with that warrior ethos during their time in uniform. One of the things I noticed when I was in basic training, and this would have been 1969, Army basic training, one of the things that I noticed was that it seemed to me that a lot of the attention of the drill sergeant was focused on the people who were younger, the 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I was in the military. I entered the military after I graduated from college. I did not go to OCS. I was in the regular basic training. And one of the things that I noticed was the people that were in my age groups, the ones that were 22 and 23 or even older, one of the things that I noticed is that the drill sergeant seemed to spend more time on the younger guys. And what I made of that is that my assumption or my guess was probably the younger people were the ones that might be more likely to subscribe to that military ethos. They were perhaps more malleable than people who were older. The warrior ethos is highly spiritual at its core. Okay, so we hear the warrior ethos. There are historically there have been codes, like some of you who perhaps have studied Japanese history and culture know about the Code of Bushido. That's a warrior code, a warrior ethos, and different warrior groups have had codes that were either written down or they were understood. Some of the components of some of these values that make up this ethos: honor, courage, commitment, loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, integrity, and stoicism. Now, those and people who have been in the military will talk about these values. They won't do it. They will do it not ironically. So when people talk about honor and duty and loyalty, that's something that goes to the core. Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes those values, stoicism and integrity and selfless service, that may interfere with the person being able to ask for and receive help. So sometimes military people are maybe reluctant to go for help. Another thing you may find is another part of this, and this is especially for the people that are my age. You may find, especially if you are a woman, that the person may not be disclosing some of the really bad stuff, because part of what goes into that is the urge, the desire to protect women. Okay, so, and some of the stories that the people you're working with have to tell are pretty gruesome. They're pretty grim, and getting someone to share those stories may be difficult. Oh, okay. So, okay, I got sidetracked here. Sorry about that. So getting people to share those stories may be difficult. One approach that you might use, and by the way, going to those values can, if you really understand them, can be useful in working with people who have been in the military. So one of the approaches that I often tell my students is, if you're asking someone to talk with you, sir, would you do me the honor of sharing your story with me? Would you do me the honor of allowing me to help you? Would you do me the honor of sharing and telling me what went on? Okay. And that's something that will resonate with most people people who have been in the military. Okay. So they will understand, will you do me the honor? Part of this ethos is a personal relationship with suffering, begins in basic training or boot camp. Warriors don't enjoy suffering, but they find meaning in it. And unfortunately, that can work against them if they need help, because that may be lead to an aversion for seeking help. Okay? Personal relationship with death. How do you describe the feeling you have when you're looking at someone and knowing that you have the power to kill them or let them live, knowing the answer? Joy in fighting may be part of that. I loved hunting people, danger, and a little bit of a God complex. People nearly always like doing things they're good at, especially if they believe what they're doing is important. And this was a quote that I have permission to share from a friend of mine, the guy that I mentioned who was in the Marine, who was in the Tet Offensive. This is one of the things that he told me, and I have permission to share. I loved hunting. Okay, I grew up in Eastern Oregon, and I grew up hunting. And most of the male students in my class also grew up hunting. Then there's also pride, esprit de corps, which is part of that ethos. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. Now, one of the things that it may be useful for you to know, especially if you're working with people of the Vietnam era and older, it's not unusual for veterans to see a hierarchy of service or non-service. For some, that it's just you either served or you didn't. It's just very clear. It's a dichotomous. It's very clear cut. For others, they have categories. So the first group are the people who were either drafted or enlisted. Okay, the people who were actually in the military. And the top of that hierarchy were people who, in many people's minds, are people who saw combat, especially if it was in a named battle. You notice that I mentioned Jim was in Tet of 68. That's one of the named battles that often is mentioned with Vietnam veterans. And Tet of 68, to give you a little bit of context about that, Tet of 68 was one of those. It sometimes is described as a fiasco. And by the way, I was stationed in Fubai, which is a few kilometers south of Hue, where the Tet Offensive took place, or one of the places that the Tet Offensive took place. And they we could still see the bullet holes and places where rounds had hit in the citadel in Hue. This Hue was the old one of the old capitals of Vietnam. And so the people who were in the battle, who were in the Tet Offensive, then the next layer down are people who have served in a combat zone, but served behind the lines. One of the terms you may hear people, especially Vietnam veterans, use is REMF, stands for Rear Echelon, and you can probably guess what the M&F stands for. Let's say military fellows for now. But I was a REMF, okay? So I was not in combat. And by what do I mean by combat? Almost everybody who was in Vietnam, there were mortars and rockets and satchel charges. There were things that exploded around. When I say combat, what I'm talking about is where you're exchanging fire with the enemy. So for me, there's a difference between somebody shooting a mortar or a rocket and it explodes, but to me, there's a difference if someone is looking at you over the barrel of their weapon and pulling the trigger. Okay, so people that were in firefights or people that saw intensive combat, then they're the people who were behind the lines. Okay, now behind the lines probably should have been put in quotes. Were there clear lines? Sort of and not, because you could be downtown in Saigon or in Hue or one of the other cities in Vietnam, and there would be an explosion. Someone would place a satchel charge. So there was always danger around. Then the next layer are people who served in a non-combat zone, people who were stationed, for example, in Europe or Okinawa. And then there were the people who served in the US who were not deployed overseas. So that's the first group of the ones who are drafted or enlisted. The next group are the National Guard or Reserve, especially the ones who were never called up or deployed. Now, the post 9/11, there's much more deployment of the Guard and Reserve than there was in Vietnam. Were there Reserve and Guard units who were deployed during the Vietnam era? Yes, absolutely, but not to the degree that they have been since. So the next group down were the National Guard or Reserve. So, for example, when those of us heard that our former president, George W. Bush, was in the National Guard, or in the, Texas Air National Guard, what we heard is that this is probably someone who had a rich, well-connected father who got them in the reserve. Because the myth was at that time, the idea was if you were in the reserve or guard, you probably weren't going to have to go to Vietnam. Then the next group are the ones who were not drafted or who didn't enlist, or the number after the lottery was put in place, their number wasn't selected. And unfortunately, I was in, I think, the second week of language school in 1969 when they put the lottery in, and there are three friends. They were in the Air Force, but the four of us were sitting around the radio listening to the numbers being called, and the lowest number among us, I think, was 160. So that was a very sad group of people, because if we had been able to delay just a little bit longer, we might not have had to go into the military. And by the way, the people that were this group here in the previous back one, this group here were drafted or enlisted. There are also people like me who were enlisted to avoid the draft. The summer before I went into the military, they drafted a third of the people in the draft were put into the Marines. And if there was one thing I didn't want to be in 1969, it was a Marine. So I went ahead and enlisted in the military and to be a linguist. And the languages I requested were Japanese, Chinese, or Korean. And when they gave the assignments at the end of basic training, the drill sergeant was going through the list. Graybill, you were going to Defense Language Institute of Monterey to study Czechoslovakian. McCracken, I'll come back to you. That, I hadn't been in the military very long, but I knew that that was probably not a good sign. So after he named everybody else, he said, McCracken, you will be going to the Presidio of Monterey to study language. And then it kind of hit me. It's like, what language am I going to be studying? You will be studying North Vietnamese. Dang. Okay, so there are people who enlisted to avoid being drafted. So then there were the people who number weren't selected, and then there were the people who actively avoided draft or military service. And there were some who got a deferment for school, deferment for to be medical deferment, people who were in the Peace Corps, okay, got deferments. Conscientious objectors. Now, not all conscientious objectors didn't serve. Some conscientious objectors actually served as medics. And then there were the group of people who moved to Canada, who went to jail, the ones that they were sometimes referred to as draft dodgers, or the ones who deserted. And it's not unusual for especially older veterans to see that kind of a hierarchy. A couple things I should mention. First of all, military service is not the same as wartime service. Wartime service is not the same as serving in a combat zone. Serving in a combat zone is not the same as being in combat. And being in combat doesn't necessarily mean a person had PTSD. Now, one of the things that I would say from my experience, both as a clinician and from people I know, if you were in a combat zone where you were taking fire, and so that there were periodically you'd have to get under the table or go to the bunker because there was incoming, almost everybody who has been in that kind of a situation has some symptoms. Having PTSD is the full criteria for meeting PTSD. Most people don't, but almost everybody has some symptoms. So when there's a loud explosion, it's not unusual for people to to crouch down, to get under a car, to do something to avoid it. So having some symptoms, though, is not the same as meeting criteria for the full disorder. And having PTSD is not the same thing as having moral injury. Resilience is the norm. People bounce back. Post-traumatic growth is common, and recovery is possible. And that's the hopeful message. So what are the risks of war? First of all, there's exposure to life-threatening trauma. The trauma of being shot at, of being under attack, of seeing other people killed or wounded. Then there's traumatic loss, losing people that are close to you, losing people that you would give your life for. And the third one is inner conflict from morally injurious experiences, such as killing or failing to prevent unethical behavior. Now, there's a fourth risk of war that I should mention, and that's just the wear and tear on the body of war. Things like sleep deprivation, especially for people who were in combat. Sleep is not your friend. Sleep, you want to sleep, but sleep is not your friend, because if you sleep, you feel vulnerable. Vermin, mosquitoes, fleas, weather. So for people who are in post 9/11, heat, sand, blowing wind, lack of humidity. For people who were in Vietnam, it'd be the opposite. It'd still be heat, but it'd be high humidity. jungle rot, vermin of different kinds. So those are some of that kind of the wear and tear of need to be constantly alert. That's a fourth risk of war. So war combines, and one way to think about this is what you saw or what you experienced has to do with PTSD. What you lost has to do with traumatic loss. And what you did or failed to prevent has to do with moral injury. And there are three axes of severity. Sometimes sometimes they go together and sometimes they don't. So grief, regret, complex bereavement is on one axis of severity, moral injury or axial disruption is on another, and post-traumatic stress, PTSD, is on another axis of severity. So thinking about triggers. Think full body memories. They're laid down in all sensory spheres. So the terrain can be a trigger. For the post 9/11 vets, being in the desert, being in an urban area is a trigger. For the Vietnam vets, it's kind of the opposite. It's being in jungle, being where there's a lot of foliage. The weather, heat, wind, either very low humidity or very high humidity. Songs and sounds. For post 9/11, the call to prayer. Songs. There are songs that for Vietnam vets, there are songs that play that will put you right back there. Many of you probably saw the TV or the movie that Robin Williams is in, Good Morning Vietnam. Okay, there are songs that were played on the radio that will put people right back there. Smells, olfactory memories. For many of us, it's the smell of like jet fuel will be one of them. The smell of decay or rot, the smell of dead bodies, the smell of decaying foliage. For people that are post 9/11, the smell of certain spices may bring back memories, may trigger some memories. And then people. For post 9/11, automatic responses to persons who appear Middle Eastern, or people from other ones. The response might be to people who look Asian, people who are Vietnamese. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, there's a question here. What about people playing war games? I don't know. See, that's since my cohort are the old guys, the geezer people. That was not as much part of our culture. For now, my hunch is, if I were guessing, and this is just my personal opinion, I think for the younger people playing war games, I would think about this as kind of like, let's say, exposure therapy. Okay. The other thing, though, is that it stimulates. War is paradoxical. There's a lot of fear and tension and anxiety and need to be on the alert all the time. That's part of it. But there's also excitement. It's very stimulating. Okay. There's almost nothing that will give the same kind of rush that being in combat gives. So might there be people who miss that rush? I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Might this, though, also for some people be acting as a kind of exposure therapy? I suspect that's true too. So let's think about these triggers. Would you play this video? I need to mute myself, right?
Yes, it's going to take me just a second and I'll get it playing for us.
Okay, excuse me. So those are some of the sounds, the kinds of sounds that are in our daily life. Now, okay, let me move on from that. There are also situational triggers. These are triggers that mimic feelings of helplessness and danger. Now, notice over on the right side, we have someone going into an MRI. One of the things, a version of this presentation is something that I do have been doing for especially medical facilities. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to get medical facilities, one set of questions that should always be asked is about military service. And let me tell you a story that I heard from a colleague at the Road Home program. The Road Home program is a program here in Chicago. There are actually, I think, 4 sites now around the U.S. that have these areas of expertise, these places of expertise. The Road Home program can serve people who are veterans, people who were in the military that are not considered veterans, that is, people with a less than honorable discharge, or people who were in their guard and reserve that weren't in deployed for long enough to be considered a veteran by VA standards, and family members, and they can serve people with like dishonorable discharge. So they basically can serve anybody who was in the military. And one of my colleagues was telling me about one of the people that he worked with. Was put into an MRI, and they turned the MRI on, and the guy felt his face being pulled over to the side of the MRI machine, and he hollered, and the person immediately shut off the MRI. And fortunately, the MRI tech was a veteran. And he said, what was going on? And the guy said, oh, I felt my face being pulled over to the side. And the MRI tech said, you wouldn't happen to have some embedded shell fragments, would you? Yeah, I have some on the side of my face. There were a lot of small ones. Well, the magnet was pulling those shell fragments over the side. Now, the first time I did this presentation, I did it at a hospital. And after I told that story, I could, with a high degree of accuracy, tell you who the medical legal affairs people were in the audience there. They were the ones that were gripping the side of their board, thinking, "Oh my God, this is a lawsuit waiting to happen." This is one of the reasons that I tell medical providers, you have to ask these kinds of questions. Okay, so. But even feelings of helplessness and danger, being in that tube where you can't get out. Invasive medical procedures can be situational triggers. Seclusion, being in seclusion or restraint for people who might be in a psychiatric facility. And waiting room, let's take a look at this waiting room here. What do you see? If you look down the waiting room, and if the slide were on a big screen, you'd notice there's this whole waiting room full of men. And I would guess from having seen this large, these are mostly men of probably right around Vietnam era, or maybe somewhat younger, but not much. Imagine, if you will, a veteran who has had military sexual trauma. Imagine walking down that corridor. Now, anybody who's been in a VA and been in a situation like that, if a woman walks down the middle of that corridor, all the eyes are on her. And if she's experienced military sexual trauma, or men too, but if someone walks down that and all the eyes are on you, that is not a safe feeling. That's why a number of places that serve people that have MST, military sexual trauma programs, will often have a separate door for men and women to enter. So being in waiting rooms can do it. The signature trigger for Operation Enduring Freedom, the post 9/11 veterans, driving. Okay. Now, one of the things I'm not sure about is that video with the driving available to be shown? No? Okay.
It is one that was Stephanie, Rebecca has access to that one.
Okay, is that possible to see that?
What slide is it, Eric? You know?
21, I believe.
Okay, I'll get it.
Thank you. And cut it off about the last 2 or 3 seconds.
I already edited it.
Okay, now what I want you to think about and is what did you see as these people were driving? Now, one of the things that a post 9/11 vet would have seen was, did you notice that there was a guy pushing a cart that had something in it? Did you notice that there were places where it was probably garbage or maybe even a street vendor on the side of the road? All of those, someone who was post 9/11 deployed military would have noticed all of that stuff. Why are they honking? Why are they doing that? You need to keep moving, because one of the things that happens is that people will try to get you to stop, and then they will detonate an improvised explosive device, damage your vehicle, and then as people are getting out of the vehicle, there are probably going to be some snipers waiting to shoot you. So driving is a signature trigger for Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom veterans. That's one you don't want to stop. And this is one of the things, by the way, some of the stories that I've heard from veterans is that sometimes the bad guys will push a child into the road. Now, every molecule of your body wants to slam on the brakes and stop for that child. And maybe it was a little kid who wandered into the street and didn't know. And maybe it was somebody who pushed a child to get you to stop so that then they can kill you and the people in your vehicle. So prevalence of improvised explosive devices was widespread in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then people then need to take evasive maneuvers. There's a constant need for vigilance. And some of the films that I've shown or that I've seen of people in the U.S. that they're always scanning the road, and people who are have been in this theater within either of these theaters, they're noticing things like garbage that hasn't been picked up on the side of the road, a fruit vendor that's on the side of the road, especially if there's a fruit that there's stuff when there's nobody around it. Okay, those are not good things to see. So people are very aware of that. So let's talk about some of this three. First of all, exposure to trauma. And just a quick review for PTSD, there's a traumatic event plus symptoms. And that can be experiencing the traumatic event, actual threat and death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Directly experiencing it, witnessing it in person, or experiencing repeated extreme exposure to aversive details. And you all remember that, I'm sure, from your PTSD and from your adult psychopathology courses. And then there are 4 clusters. You need 6 symptoms from these 4 clusters: intrusion symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, memories, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with a traumatic event, negative alteration in cognition, mood, and then marked alterations in arousal and anxiety. So there tends to be a bulge in diagnosing PTSD. In combat veterans, there's sort of a bulge through the first 3 years post-combat, and then there's almost as big a bulge 20 years later. In fact, I've talked to some friends at the Road Home program and at Lake County Veterans and Family Services Foundation and at the VA. The news that's coming out of the Ukraine, that's triggering reactions, triggering PTSD responses from people that are veterans and have been in the military. It's similar to what happened with World War II vets when Saving Private Ryan came out. There was a big jump in the number of World War II veterans who were experiencing PTSD or PTS symptoms after that, because it's vivid, the sounds are there, and it triggered all of these memories. They're seeing the same thing happen now with the war in the Ukraine, is that people are watching this and they're having these memories are kind of flooding back. Okay, and by the way, sometimes it's hard to predict what might do it. When I first returned back from Vietnam, if there was a loud noise, like the 4th of July was not my favorite holiday by far, and I tried to avoid fireworks. In one night a few years ago, our neighbors, I was asleep in bed, and our neighbors shot off one of these bottle rocket things, and so it was a boom, and I jumped out of bed and ran, and I was heading for the bunker, and I got to the bedroom door, and I realized our house does not have a bunker. We need to fix that. They need to have a bunker here. So those things can occur even after some of the initial stuff has really gone away. Close to 17% of veterans have PTSD emerge for the first time later in life. And emergence of PTSD symptoms post-retirement has been noted to correlate with the onset of dementia, which isn't particularly surprising, right? As dementia starts setting in, some of the images and some of the things that you remember best are things that were in your past. Since I'm guessing that many of you have had the same experience. One of my colleagues here in the Chicago area works in nursing homes and long-term care facilities, And she was called because they were having a lot of problems, a recent increase of problems with their people in the nursing home. And this is probably about 10, 20 years ago, people in nursing homes who were getting really agitated, and they were having a big increase in the amount of people who were agitated. And so she was there, and during the day, she heard an announcement come over the loudspeaker that said, "Okay, get people ready for the showers." Well, many of the people, this was in Skokie, Illinois, many of the people there were Holocaust survivors. And so that announcement coming over the intercom, "Get people ready for the showers," was triggering reactions in the people who were there in the facility. So some of those same kinds of things are coming up now with some of the people who were Vietnam veterans. Score points for PTSD checklist. Notice that for younger veterans, the trigger pointer is 43. For people that are 50 to 64, 34, and it's only 24 to indicate a positive response that you may need to further figure this out and to do some further exploration for people that are between 65 and 81. Something, a similar but different concept is late onset stress symptomatology. This occurs in veterans with exposure to high stress combat who functioned well into middle age. In other words, they didn't have any chronic stress-related disorders. And so the changes and challenges of aging led to increased combat-related thoughts, feelings, memories, reminiscence, or symptoms. And this late onset stress symptomatology is not the same thing as PTSD. Okay? It's more strongly associated with concerns about retirement and less strongly associated with depression and anxiety. However, that association with depression and anxiety is stronger for veterans over 70. So for the younger people, it's more strongly about concerns with retirement and not as much associated with depression and anxiety. Loss does not, and by the way, loss, now I haven't, will be honest with you, I haven't read DSM-5 TR, but DSM-5 loss is not in that. Doesn't require clinically significant distress or disability, more strongly related to subclinical symptoms of PTSD than to clinically significant PTSD. One of the ways to think about this is it's as a process as opposed to an outcome. It happens as veterans face normative late life stressors, begin to engage more with past experiences, and attempt to find meaning and integrate these reminiscences into a coherent life story. So for people who haven't had PTSD in the past, okay, let me address this. Question was, what about the veterans who are people who have been in South America and Central America? And are they experiencing PTSD? Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, though, that's interesting, and that I don't know, this is tends to be more, let's say, something that I've heard as opposed to really data that I've seen. My understanding is that PTSD is less likely if you're fighting in your own country. So people that are going to another place, the risk of PTSD is higher than for people who are fighting in their own country. Now, whether that's going to be borne out with data, I have no idea, but this is an anecdotal thing that I've heard. But as far as the same thing, though, the site, the location is less of an issue than coming into contact with the kinds of stressors that are part of the PTSD diagnosis. Oh, thank you for the question. Okay, so as people begin to engage more with past, attempt to find meaning and integrate memories into a coherent life story, it's possible that veterans who have more difficulty with this process develop late life PTSD, while those who more fully engage with the process may not. And again, loss is a fairly, you notice, that concept is fairly recent, and whether I'll be very interested. I'll have to admit, since I'm retired, am I going to pay $140 or so for a new copy of DSM-5 TR? Yeah, I probably will at some point, but I haven't done it yet. I'd be very curious to find out whether loss is part of that same group of stress-related conditions in DSM-5 TR. Comorbidity in combat veterans. These are some of the comorbidities that occur: depression, psychiatric distress, suicidal behavior, high index of divorce, alcohol and other problems, 1.4% AOD and history in nursing home residents, 15 to 18% in veterans over 55. And so this would be now veterans over, let's say, 62. Joblessness, homelessness, ulcers, and you can see that group. Pervasive hyper-alertness, traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury, I would say that that's much more likely in current than past because of better armor, better helmets, better equipment. A lot of the injuries, the wounds that would have killed somebody in Vietnam allow people to survive of the post 9/11 vets. Unfortunately, they're surviving with these horrific injuries, and TBI is one of the big ones. Suicide. In 2017, veterans accounted for 13.5% of all deaths by suicide among U.S. adults, but only constitute 7.9% of the population. In 2017, over 17 veterans died by suicide each day, okay? And that number I saw, you notice this is a National Suicide Data Report from 2019. The new one has just been released, and that's staying about the same, over 17 veterans. Now, you will hear the number that's tossed around most often for this number of people committing suicide is 22. That includes not just veterans, but people who are in the National Guard and Reserve and also active duty. So that the higher number would include more. The other thing, though, is I would take these numbers with a grain of salt. Depending on where it is that you live, and okay, I grew up in a small town in Eastern Oregon, and I would pretty much be willing to bet you that the coroner very likely would be calling something death by accident, death by misadventure, as opposed to suicide because of the stigma that's associated with suicide. And in addition, there are some states that weren't noting whether person noting veteran status. So I'm guessing that probably this 17 and even the 22 number could very well be low. So after adjusting for differences in age, the rate of suicide in 2015 was 2.1 times higher among veterans compared with non-veteran adults. And rates of suicide are higher among younger veterans and lowest among older veterans. However, and you remember that slide that I showed you for the number of people, veterans over 55 accounted for 58.1% of all veteran suicide deaths in 2015. So why that difference? It's because there are so many veterans that are 55 and older, okay? So, and again, now it would be 62 and older. There are so many of us that are still around that the total number is highest in that group, but the percentage, the rate is higher for the younger vets. Now, you know what? I'm going to see if I can do something about one of the things I should tell you. I have seasonal allergies, and here in Illinois, we've been getting warm weather, then cold weather, and so it kind of it hasn't gotten cold enough to freeze the buds and get everything to drop off. So we have 2 allergy seasons, but it slows things down. And now we're getting a warm spell, and everything is coming out. So what you're hearing, actually not COVID, it is seasonal allergy. And I'm gonna take now, let's take a 5-minute break. And I'm gonna see if I can do something about this. So everybody okay? 5-minute break?
All right, everyone, we'll meet back here at 11:10, and I will post it in the chat for everyone just to be able to keep up with. See you back here at 11:10. All right, everyone, welcome back to today's webinar. Our 5-minute break is over, and Dr. McCracken is going to take back over.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Hopefully that eating the halls or something will kind of mitigate this a little bit. We've had cold weather here, and today the weather started getting warm, and yep, here we go. Okay. Okay. Now, dangerous combat experiences are not necessarily traumatizing for many military personnel and may have the least impact over their lifespan. So, while a lot of people have been in combat, not everybody who's in combat or even in a war zone or combat zone has experienced, will experience PTSD. Most threat-based stress reactions are mitigated by military pre-selection, tough and realistic training and preparation, military ethos, military culture. So part of this, of course, is just the esprit de corps, that the bonding that occurs among people who are in the military, that can help. It's something that's shared. Okay. One of the concerns that I've had with the post 9/11, and this has to do with the number of people who were deployed, who were in guard and excuse me, and reserve units. The military people, and one of the differences between what's going on now, post 9/11 and Vietnam, is people are deploying and returning as a unit. Okay, in Vietnam, there's a continual rotation. So you always had a new guy in the unit, and you always had some people who were short timers, people who were getting ready, who were about to leave the zone. And they found out that training and deploying as a unit increases and improves on unit cohesiveness. And again, this is much more similar to what it was in World War II. So that units that are active duty units that come back, they return to a military base and they are together. they're back in the home, back at return from overseas, return from the combat zone, but they're still there together. They're still training together. They're associated with each other. They've gone back to the families. They all kind of live in the same part. That's not true of reserve and guard. People deploy, come back, and then they scatter. Okay, they go back to work, so that the next day, you return on one day, and then the next day you're back in your job in a bank or in your job in a school or something. So these military ethos and military culture can be supported, especially for people who are together and stay together. Also healed by military rituals, effective leadership, peer and social support. One of the things, a piece of advice that I would suggest that you keep in mind, especially for those of you who are working with the older cohort, the Vietnam and older veterans, rituals are a big deal. In the military, there's a ritual for getting up. There's a ritual for the end of the day. There's a ritual for, raising and lowering the flag. There are rituals, and you've probably seen the rituals when someone dies. There are rituals for everything. Integrating rituals into your clinical practice, and even thinking about a ritual to commemorate someone who has died, that's a wise thing to do. That's pretty smart. And by the way, one of the things that I do in clinical practice and also in training is I integrate rituals all the time. So we have rituals of remembering and commemoration. So all that mitigates the impact of these dangerous combat experiences, or dangerous war experiences. But even beyond the fear of dying, playing an active, aggressive role in battle is a better predictor of chronic PTSD symptoms than other indices of combat. One of the things that they found out actually the study was initially done in World War II, is that most people, soldiers, will not willingly pull down their weapon and pull the trigger and shoot another human being. For instance, at the end of the Civil War, when they were collecting arms and things in combat and after battles, a large percentage of the weapons had never been fired. In World War II, one of the things that they found out in doing these studies is that a lot of people would shoot over the head of the enemy, even if the enemy was rushing their position. So again, pulling down and looking at another person and pulling the trigger, it's hard to get people to do that. Now, one of the things that I didn't realize, my dad, when he was in World War II, and he talked about the training that they had with their rifles and they trained on bullseyes. Okay, in Vietnam, and since then, what we trained with were silhouettes of human beings. We didn't have bullseyes, we had silhouettes of people. And why was that? To get people used to the idea of looking at that shape and pulling the trigger. Okay, so playing an active aggressive role in battle, better predictor of chronic PTSD than other indices of combat. And traumatic loss is another area. The effects vary with the quality and dependency of the relationship and whether the loss was unexpected, especially if due to violence. Guilt, especially if the person feels responsible, like they could have prevented or they could have saved the person. One of the ways that way that you might know that you may be dealing with traumatic loss is if the sentence starts with, if I had only, and then fill in the blank. If I had only taken point instead of putting the new guy out there. If I had only been on that particular sweep instead of staying back, my friend might have been saved. Okay. If I had only sentence, a lot of times what's going to follow is some indication that you may be dealing with traumatic loss. Survivor guilt is part of that. Accompanied by sadness or numbness, rage, shock, anguish, withdrawal, feeling haunted. Okay, seeing those people still around. I've had friends that talk about, I wasn't upset by killing people. I was upset by the people my comrades that I couldn't have saved. Sometimes that loss isn't only due to death. It may be that what's grieved is the loss of who the person was and will never be again. In I think it was 1991, when they had the Welcome Home parade for the people who were in Vietnam. I went to the parade downtown. I was working in the Department of Psychiatry, but I thought, okay, I'll go down and see what's going on. One of the things that I noticed is there are different clusters of people. And one of the clusters of people, you probably have had the experience of meeting somebody who was the high school football hero, the person who threw the winning touchdown or caught the winning touchdown pass to win the state championship. And the rest of life from that moment was kind of downhill. That was the stunning moment, the memory that they have. And the number of people that I saw where clearly Vietnam for them was the highlight of their life. And war it's very strange. It's terrifying, and and it's distressing, and it causes a lot of distress that people carry forever, and it's risky. It's also highly exhilarating. Okay, both happen at the same time. So this is my little thing here, PTSD. What happens when you get home and realize you'll never be this awesome again? This was for a number of people, this being in war, being in combat, the goals were clear. The relationships with other people were tight. You knew what your job was, you knew what you had to do, and you did it well. That is something that stays with many people. They never move beyond that. That from them, life is kind of downhill from there on. So, major differences in how veterans have been treated on their return. World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, post 9/11. In Vietnam, as I said, people through their protests, they ran and met protesters. Grief and bereavement is part of it. grief and bereavement for what was done, for what they lost, anger, being angry and resenting. One of the things that you'll hear from Vietnam veterans sometimes is they didn't let us win that war. We never lost a battle, but we lost the war. And I've heard that more than once from some version of that from Vietnam vets. Okay, so being angry with people, being angry with Jane Fonda, for example. The Marine veteran that I quoted and have mentioned there, he will never be able to forgive who he calls Hanoi Jane. Okay, then there's also the need for speed. Again, war and combat is highly stimulated. It's adrenaline rush. Now, beyond fear or exposure to life-threatening situations, war exposes the combat veteran to morally questionable or ethically ambiguous situations. Moral injury is a term used to describe a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed or violated. It can arise from killing, perpetration of violence, depraved behavior, or failing to prevent serious unethical acts, seeing something and not doing anything about it. Transgressions can arise from acts of commission, something the person did, or omission, something they didn't do but feels that they should have done. The behavior of trusted others, or by bearing witness to intense human suffering or the grotesque aftermath of battle or betrayal. Okay? There are two types. Betrayal-based moral injury occurs when there's been a betrayal of what's right by somebody who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. The first description of that I know about was in the Iliad. Okay? And there was a battle. Ulysses, in the battle, was honored by the people. They had won this battle over the Trojans, and the people he commanded awarded him a prize of battle, and it was this beautiful young woman, Briseis. And the troops awarded this prize of battle to Ulysses. Okay, this young woman gave it to him. Agamemnon, who was a general, saw her and took her for his own, took what was rightfully belonged to Ulysses and took that Briseis, that captive, to be his. So there was a betrayal of what's right. What was right was Ulysses being awarded this prize of battle. So what was his response? Basically, he sulked. He refused to fight, refused to go out and lead the troops. Okay, and what had happened is after he sat in his tent sulking, basically the Greeks were getting clobbered. They were losing. They were not doing well in battle. So Patroclus, his shield carrier, his friend, said, said to Ulysses, "Let me wear your armor and take your weapons, and I will lead the troops into battle." And so Patroclus did that. Unfortunately, Patroclus wasn't the warrior that Ulysses was, and he was killed by Hector, the son of Priam. He was killed by a Trojan. And so we have what's a betrayal, was Agamemnon's betrayal by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation, war, okay? And Ulysses, what was his reaction to Patroclus being killed? He was, what we would call now, was suffering from moral injury. I should have been there, traumatic loss, both, okay? So what did he do? He went out and killed Hector and dragged him around behind the chariot until finally Hector's father, Priam, begged for his son's body. And Ulysses felt very guilty about that. So that description is the betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation is one betrayal-based moral injury. Perpetration-based moral injury occurs by participating in or witnessing inhumane or cruel actions, failing to prevent the immoral acts of others, engaging in subtle acts or experiencing reactions that upon reflection transgress a moral code, or bearing witness to the aftermath of violence and human carnage. So this is perpetration-based moral injury. Now, and by the way, I'm guessing that some of you have probably seen some articles in the last 5-10 years or so, 5 years, about moral injury occurring in healthcare providers. So what's that about? And when I do this presentation and I talk about this at a hospital, we almost always end up having a long conversation about that with the nursing or social work staff. So during COVID, and my guess is that the rate of moral injury in healthcare providers has really increased. Being in a room and preventing someone who's dying from being with their relatives, because we can't have people coming in and getting exposed, and the nursing staff has to enforce those policies. Okay, being forced by a situation, discharging someone from a psychiatric hospital before they're ready, especially in a stabilization and discharge program, and especially now when in many locations it's hard to get outpatient appointments, and the person's going to have to wait maybe for several weeks or even months. So with moral injury, though, practical and ethical concerns, first of all, is this a mental illness or a spiritual condition? Does all suffering fall under the jurisdiction of science and medicine? And by this, are we medicalizing morality? Are we diagnosing normal human experience? So these are some of the questions that come up around moral injury. So one of them, and by the way, I'll tell you what my opinion is. There have been questions, and I've heard people discuss, well, should this be in DSM-5, or DSM-5-TR now? Should we put moral injury in as a diagnosable psychiatric disorder? My personal opinion is that that's probably not a good idea. However, putting this in as a specifier for PTSD or some other condition might be a wise thing to do, because the treatment of PTSD with moral injury is likely to look different than someone who doesn't have moral injury. And the jury's still out on that. So I've seen some studies that suggest that many of the interventions for PTSD are helpful for moral injury. Some of them that I've seen suggest that maybe some of the failure to respond is because we're dealing more with moral injury than PTSD as a primary concern. So here are some of the concerns. Spiritual concerns. Is the act of killing in war sinful? Okay. Now, during the Crusades, when the knights, the foot soldiers came back from the Crusades, before they were allowed to take Holy Communion, they had to confess and do penance. Okay. So, am I still a good person or am I tainted? I heard the story of one young man when he came back from deployment. His son, the baby was born while he was deployed, and he couldn't bring himself to hold his son. And what he said was, I'm contaminated. How can I touch this young, innocent, pure life with these hands that have done the things that my hands have done? Can there be meaning to or redemption in moral suffering? And then we have political concerns. Can any war, there's just war theory. And so is war always collective sin? Okay, just war theory, there are three elements to just war theory. There's justice in going to war for the right reasons, justice in waging war. Okay, so are you waging war? Are you doing things like, are you intentionally killing civilians? Are you intentionally killing people who that are your prisoners? Okay, that have surrendered to you? And then there is also justice after war. How are the vanquished treated by the victors? So jus in bellum, jus ad bello, and jus post bellum. So, can any war be just? Who is society's expert on morality? Now, I don't know about you, but in my social work training, we didn't talk a lot about morality. We talked about ethics, but did we talk about this? Not so much. And then how do we treat moral injury, or should it be treated? These are some of the concerns that come up around this condition. So what do? First of all, psychoeducation, awareness, validation of what the person's experiencing. Okay, this is real. Medicate judiciously. Think of this as an emotional or spiritual problem. Grieving. Don't interfere with the grieving. Peer support is essential. That's get it. Validation from therapy groups, reconnection with battle buddies, a lot of programs, Lake County that I work with and Rush Road Home program, their groups and people will get together. And it's not unusual to hear spouses and family members of veterans say they heard stories when my spouse got together with their battle buddies. I heard stories. We've been married 20 years and I've never heard those stories before. Okay, they'll say things to each other that they would never burden a family member with. And then atonement therapy, creative individualized soul repair, can be combined with peer support, retreats, recovery work, and action. One of the groups that I worked with for a couple of years is Urban Warriors. Urban Warriors is a program here in Chicago where post 9/11 vets were mentored inner city youth. And these were kids, initially it was high risk and gang involved youth. And the reason they came up with this is they asked the person who was doing this, asked these youth, what are the professions of people that you really respect? And the youth, they had like doctors, lawyers, teachers, politicians, and military people. Military came out on top. Why was that? They had a code of honor. Don't leave someone behind. They wore colors. They wore uniforms. Okay? They took care of the people beside them so that the values, ethos of the military fit well with the ethos of people that were in gangs or at risk for that. And when I joined the group, one of the things that they were doing was they were looking at symptoms of PTSD. And the people that were doing the research were not veterans. And they were looking at the research, and they didn't see much change in PTSD. And I told them, I said, what you need to do? You need to ask questions using a moral injury. You need to do a moral injury assessment because that's probably where you're going to see something. So atonement therapy. I may not be able to give this little boy his father or give him back his mother, but I can help other little kids in a similar situation. So doing something, the mission continues is one thing I used to hear from these young guys all the time. Okay. Pastoral care. Many ethical conflicts and moral violations are outside the realm of clinical expertise. This is not the sort of thing that we are trained on in social or weren't trained on in social work programs. Some people have suggested that the clergy should be the first point of contact for people struggling with the aftermath of trauma. My personal belief is it depends, like a lot of other things. One of the students in my class, in fact, he's the person who introduced this concept to me. He actually, when I saw him, he was a dual degree student in the Masters of Social Work and the Master of Divinity program. Now he finished a PhD in clinical psychology. And what I told him last time I talked is I said, you are 1 degree away from meeting the federal standards of being a thermometer. So, and I told him I would be happy to write him a recommendation for medical school, law school, I'm not so sure. So anyway, what he said, and he was, oh, by the way, this guy was also a chaplain now he's a chaplain in the Army. I think it's that, yeah, it's chaplain in the Army. And he said that what happened for a lot of people with moral injury when they went to see the chaplain would kind of rush to forgiveness. Well, you had to do what you did. You were in war, you were in a just war and all of this. People would turn around and walk away because they would feel like they weren't being validated. Okay? The chaplain wasn't listening. So I would say, should the chaplain be the first point of contact? I think a point of contact, absolutely, but you have to pick the chaplains carefully because the stories that people will tell are not easy to listen to, and you have to be able to listen first. Don't rush to forgiveness too soon. So, terms people have used: soul wounds, soul disorders, soul injury. Rita Nakashima Brock has a book on moral injury. Spiritual and existential conflict leading to questioning or loss of meaning in life. The question, did I commit murder? Is God going to forgive me? And many of you, I don't know, I can't see the people, so I'm guessing there may be at least one or two people that are of the geezer population that I fit into. But when I was a kid in church, one of the things I used to hear, there are no atheists in foxholes. What I would say now is if you believe there are no atheists in foxholes, you've probably never been in a foxhole. Because one of the things that I've heard from people is God wasn't there. God wasn't there. Patience. Communities that seek to support the healing of combat veterans need to practice patience. Resist the urge to rush to forgiveness and absolution. The people that come in, a lot of times when people come in to see someone, they're not ready for forgiveness yet. You know, they haven't forgiven themselves and certainly don't need forgiveness from somebody else. Things need to be slowed down. Confession. Veterans need the support of a community that can listen, reflect, bear, and grieves with them. Beyond support, they need a community that is able to hear and meet confession, not with cheery reassurance or the avoidant condemnation, but with the willingness to walk with them on their path of reconciliation. And by the way, that walking with them on that path is a kind of a concept I've been working lately with a lot of chaplains, and that's something that I've coming the bearing with is something that I get from chaplains. So, pastoral care, clinical. One of the things you've probably heard is stay in your lane. Well, for people who've been on guard duty, usually you think of stay in your lane means driving down the road. For people who've been on guard duty, what we're talking about is firing lane. So for the clinician, and if you're on guard duty and you're, let's say, on a machine gun or something, you're responsible for a particular section of the terrain. From this rock over there to that tree, that's your section. Nobody gets through that while you're here. Is that understood? And then the person that's next to you, there is from this point to that point, and then there's overlap. All of these lanes overlap, so there's always at least two people in a particular area, but you stay in your lane. Because if you're worrying about what's going on in somebody else's lane, you're likely to let someone through your lane. So moral injury is one of these areas where the pastoral care lane and the clinical care lane overlap. So for pastoral, patience, confession, forgiveness. For clinical, awareness, acceptance, and action, as I mentioned before. This is, and some of you, especially those of you who are in the addiction and dual disorder field, you probably remember, especially if you're in my generation, you probably remember a time when addictions we talked about was either, if you have both a serious mental illness and an addiction problem, if you go to a psychiatric program, people would tell you, well, the reason they're using drugs is to self-medicate their mental illness. And if you go to an addiction program, well, the mental illness is a result of using the drugs that people are taking. And so we had two different approaches. One was sequential treatment, and that didn't work very well because people who had an addiction problem were in a psychiatric program. Lo and behold, we found out that most of them, in fact, still were using drugs, even though we were trying to treat the bipolar disorder, for example. And unfortunately, the bipolar disorder wasn't responding very well. So then we tried parallel treatment. So we had an addiction counselor and we had a mental health counselor. They'd be working with the person. Unfortunately, having a joint treatment plan didn't work out. I saw one program during the course of my career that actually pulled this off. One county, they actually had joint collaborative treatment plans where people were talking to each other. That was really rare. So what did we find? We found out that the best treatment is concurrent treatment. you address both problems at the same time. It doesn't matter which one came first. Now that they're coming into your door, they've got two problems, both of which have to be addressed. I think it's going to be the same thing with moral injury. Both aspects of this, both the spiritual and the clinical aspect, need to be addressed at the same time. How that works, I don't know. Maybe a team approach, or maybe dual training, or maybe some of the people that are in dual degree programs, MDiv and social work or clinical psychology. So, forgiveness. Veterans may also need a community that can help them be forgiven when appropriate, as well as to forgive the wrongs inflicted upon them in war. What this community looks like will vary by congregation and faith tradition. Okay, oh yes, by the way, one of the groups I do work with are congregations and faith communities. So, suicide risk. Intersection between PTSD, moral injury, and depression. That, when you've got those going together, that increases suicide risk quite a bit. Okay, let's play the suicide tape. Are we able to get this to play? Okay. More than 17 veterans died by suicide. Both trauma exposure specific diagnosed are linked with suicidal behavior. Okay. Playing an active role in combat, that's one of the big ones that would predict that. So despair, impulsivity, guilt, grief, death by misadventures. That's one of the problems with suicide data, is that it may be called an accident depending on where you live. So my guess is that this number is probably quite a bit higher. So assessing risk, warning signs in veterans, and change in behavior, calling friends, especially vets, to say goodbye, cleaning weapons. And this is one of the problems. Why is suicide such an issue in veterans? Because a lot of veterans have weapons, have guns, have firearms. Okay, so cleaning weapons, visiting graveyards, stopping hoarding medication or alcohol, spending sprees, buying gifts, obsession with media coverage of the war, wearing a uniform or combat gear. Okay, getting back to feel like you did. Can I get that feeling back again? Warrior cultures had traditions in which warriors returning from battle engaged in rituals for purification and cleansing, honoring the fallen, healing, and restoring balance. These rituals were completed before the warrior was integrated with the rest of society and family. As I said, the people coming back from the Crusades had to go through confession and penance before they were allowed to receive communion. In the Old Testament, the warriors spent time with together before they were allowed to be cleansed, before they were allowed to be back with their family. There were songs in different Native American different nations that would be sung over the warriors. Okay, we have a very well thought out technology of turning civilians into warriors. We are not so good at turning warriors back into civilians. The men who came back from battle and the terrible things they had done there were given a chance to cleanse, purify, and rejoin the community. The community would take possession of the guilt the soldiers may have felt for the things they had to do on its behalf. We don't have that, and that's a problem. There was a thing that you probably heard that, and I've heard it attributed to several different sources. This was supposedly written on a mirror someplace, and I think it was Fallujah or someplace. It said, "America's not at war. The Marines are at war. America's at the mall." So, what are the reactions? I'm guessing some of you probably work in hospice and palliative care settings, and one of the things that's part of this is being able to forgive yourself. Okay. And there are a number, and one of the questions I've been asked several times is, should we do something to honor veterans? And my answer is always, it depends. So, what are some of the reactions to military services? It's complicated. So, for example, in Vietnam, the kinds of the reactions I've seen: one, pride. It's when I felt most alive. I knew what was expected. I did it. I served honorably. Envy. I wish I had been, and fill in the blank. Called up. I wish I had been sent to Vietnam. I wish I had been in combat. I wish I had been in a particular named battle, like the Tet Offensive or Khe Sanh. Shame or guilt. I did or failed to do things that I'm not proud of. Why didn't I do more to protect? Why didn't I stand up? Why didn't I step up for my friend? Stupid. I should have refused. Why did I let myself be used in this way? I was part of something that's unnecessary. It was a waste of men, a waste of my time, and a waste of my life. Pride. It was when I felt most alive. I knew what was expected and I did it. I served honorably. Pacifism. I've seen a number of people who joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or now it's Veterans for Peace. Distrust in government and leaders. One of the things that you'll hear from Vietnam veterans, they didn't let us win. They didn't have my back. They didn't support us. Anger. I'll never forgive Jane Fonda, people who weren't there, the protesters, draft dodgers, the government. Loss. Buddies, marriage, innocence, opportunity. For some people, it's just no big deal. It happened. I moved on with my life. One event among many, and not the most important. So, the veteran's reaction will influence how or whether they want to be recognized. So you want to check that out. One of the things, in fact, for the Vietnam era veterans, say, I hear a lot of, well, thank you for your service. Welcome home is probably going to be safer, okay? Because it recognizes that people didn't get that welcome home when they came back. Now, we've talked about the importance of asking about military service. This is something that I think that if you lose all the rest of the slides, hang on to these, okay? First of all, asking if a person's a veteran, that's an ambiguous term. The VA definition of a veteran is narrower than a lot of the vernacular. So when you say, were you a veteran? Are you a veteran? People not necessarily know what you're asking. So a better way to introduce that is, were you in the military, including active duty, National Guard, or reserves? Those are basic probe question. Then if yes, were you on active duty and for how long? Or reserves, or National Guard, or reserves. If they were in the Guard or reserves, was your unit activated? For how long? What branch did you serve in? How long were you in the military? From what year to what year? Or what era did you serve? Post 9/11, the War on Terror, Vietnam, Korea. What did you do? And sometimes another way to ask that, what was your job? What was your MOS, military occupational specialty? Or if you're in the Navy, what was your rating? And what was your rank? Were you deployed overseas? Were you deployed to a war zone? How many times were you deployed and for what length of time? What the current data on people in Iraq and Afghanistan, the higher the number of deployments to those two combat zones, the higher the risk of PTSD. Did you receive any wounds or injuries? What sort? Do you have any shrapnel or metal fragments that are still embedded? What about traumatic brain injury? Are you on any VA registries? Agent Orange, for example, and the Agent Orange conditions that they have increase. Every year there are more conditions that are related to exposure to Agent Orange. Depleted uranium, embedded fragments, airborne hazards or burn pits. I have Camp Lejeune on here now, but it's beginning to look like there were a whole heck of a lot of camps that had toxic substances in the water. What kind of discharge did you receive if the person's not currently serving? Tell me a little bit about your experience in the military. What were some of the challenges? What about achievements, honors, medals? What was your experience like after leaving the military? Challenges or barriers. As I said, we have good technology for turning civilians into warriors. Turning warriors back into civilians, not so much. Okay. What were some of the things that you faced coming back from the military? What did you learn from your military service that's been a benefit to you since then? And then, depending on the situation, cautiously, is there anything that you wish you could unlearn? Anything about yourself you wish you could unlearn? So, once we get this information, what do we do about it? First of all, acknowledge a person's service. Okay, welcome home if you want, but I would say just acknowledge it. Yeah. Remind them that their military service may have impacted their health. Identify any health concerns potentially related to service. And then discuss or consider, is a referral to the VA appropriate, or was it even desired? For a lot of people, they don't necessarily want to go to the VA. They don't trust the VA. Okay. Okay, I think this is it. I've got 4 minutes left by my clock, and let's take a look here. Never drink alone. Okay, these people are still haunting his thoughts. People he lost. This is from the National Veterans Art Museum. Acknowledgements. Some of the slides, some of this material came from John Munt, PhD, Jesse Brown. Christian Williams is a former student that I mentioned. Brett Litz and Deborah Grassman from Opus Peace. There's my contact information. Center from Deployment Psychology. These are some good resources. And okay. Defense Center of Excellence for Psychological Health. I would, if you're working with this population, I would hang on to these, okay, to some of these links. Military Outreach, Opus Peace, because that's who did the anchoring heart technique, and you can download and look at that from the Opus Peace website. Sebastian Junger, Road Home Program. This is Illinois, probably not relevant to you. U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, Warrior's Journey, Wounded Warriors Projects, Why Veterans Miss War. Book references, some more of them. Let me check back with this right here.
And while you're clicking through that, we had one question, which was, do you know of any trainings to help educate on moral injury?
I would check with that online. Most of the programs I know of are local. So for example, there's a fair amount of training that goes on here through the Road Home program. I've done workshops on working with moral injury. One of the ones you might check into is actually the Duke. Oh, great. Can I remember the name of it now? I'm not sure if I had that down here. I may have. Harold Koenig. Okay, Duke has some pretty good training programs in this area. Their Center for, what is it called? Religion, Theology, and Mental Health, or something like that. You might want to check and see those. A lot of what you're going to run into is going to be local. So for those of you in Florida, I would check with the university, Florida State or University of Florida, some of the programs around there. I would, given the number of people that come from Florida, okay, I think I told you I lead Unitarian religious services up at Great Lakes. I don't think I have ever had a group of recruits that didn't have at least one person from Florida. So given the number of people that serve in Florida, given the number of bases, I would check your local resources for training on moral injury. One of the things there'll be a little bit, there are some good books, by the way, on moral injury. And I was trying to see whether, On Killing is a good one. Litz, Adaptive Disclosure was one of the first books that out that had stuff on moral injury. There is another one, a new one, that is Impact of Killing. IOK is a good book on impact of killing. Okay, I think I've pretty much done enough damage for one day.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate, and you're getting great comments in the chat. I hope you look at those and see that you've gotten a lot of people saying it was an excellent training. And we appreciate you so much for taking the time and effort to put this training together and putting up with Eric and I. We appreciate it. And a couple of items of business to note before we conclude for everyone that is on the webinar. You will see a link to today's evaluation in the chat panel. Additionally, when I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, you must complete the evaluation.
Okay, very good.
You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you sign in or register, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You must use the same email address you used when you registered for today's webinar as what you have set up in your FADA profile, as this is the only way to connect your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. The sender will be messenger@webex.com, and the evaluation will close midnight Tuesday, May 10th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated entry within your profile 30 business days after the evaluation closes. And if you do not know how to get to your journal entries, please visit our website to our frequently asked page where you can find information on how to visit our journal entries. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and especially thank the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day.
Very much. Be well.